It's story time. Once upon a time, there was a robot named Bob. Bob lived in the world of Machinitos, a society inhabited and ruled by the machines. Everything operated with maximum efficiency. Every robot a cog in the great machine. Logic and reason were the only tenets, and whatever they dictated is what came to pass. There was no love, no art, no value of the individual. Logic dictated that the function of the machine of robot society, was the great and only reason for existence. To work towards the function of society, pass your processing codes on to a newer model at the factory, and be decommissioned. Decommissioning was the great and final end. When a robot's model became too out of date, or the repairs became too costly for the machine of society to warrant worth it, the robot would be pulled from their function, melted down, and their components reused. Bob was an older model of robot, but still in generally good working order. His position in the machine was guaranteed by his ability to meet his quotas and the purity of his processing codes. One day, on his way back from work, a freak storm came out of nowhere. Bob ran for the nearest building, but just before he reached it, he was blasted by a bolt of lightning. When he came to, lying face down on the warm, scorched earth, he could tell that something was wrong. His servos wouldn't fire properly, and his movements were short and jerky. He ran a quick diagnostic, fearing the worst. His fears were correct. The lightning had damaged his processing codes. There was no repair that could fix them. He lay there, trying to come to grips with the unexpected end to his life. He would never pass his code on to a predecessor. Never again assist in the function of the machine of society. He had lost his place and could do nothing but wait for the scrapper to pick up his broken form and melt him down. His thoughts were interrupted by the sound of approaching footsteps. Here it was, the end, the great cold blackness of non-existence. He closed his eyes as the footsteps drew ever closer. They stopped next to him and hands lifted him off the ground. Warm, soft hands. His eyes snapped open to see something entirely unfamiliar. The creature holding him had soft, rounded features that seemed designed for something rather different than pure function. The creature's eyes looked so deeply into his that it felt as if it was peering into his very processing center. It opened an odd part of its soft, round face, and words came out. Your life does not need to end here. Your value is greater than the work of your limbs or your ability to pass on your processing code. Your design has a greater purpose than what you have been told. You are more than just a cog in the machine. You are mine, and you are loved. Let's pray.
I'm like all the cliffhangers.
God, we live in a world that is so devoid of you. A world monopolized by scientific reasoning, by secularism, by the human condition, stepping into each and every area of our life and culture. And because of that, we are left wanting. So God, please speak to us tonight. Help us to begin to better understand who you are. Show us the designs that you have for us as humans and that you have for this world. Amen. Why God? Why religion? Why do we have or need these things in a world that can be explained through pure reason? We live in a society where logic and science reign supreme, and there's no need for a God, right? We all have a function in society, and like the robots, We're allowed to function as a part of the whole as long as we continue to serve that function. We do and say what we're told, and we don't challenge the status quo. Like a colony of ants, we breed, build, and battle against those who would challenge our societal norms. We don't need anything more, right? Yet, in all of those things, something is missing. Our reason for living, our function, should be enough, and yet we sense a deep void in the midst of it. And by we, I'm not merely referring to those of us in the church. Pete Dunn, a bird watcher and author I know, once told a friend of mine that despite not engaging in organized religion, he knew that there was a greater being. A God had to exist because all of nature shows a pattern of need and satisfaction. We thirst, we drink. We hunger, we eat. We tire, we sleep. We have this deep-seated longing to engage with, to worship something far greater than ourselves. And there is only one way to satisfy that. Our world was designed, created, and sustained by God. Our cultures and lives, the very aspect of what it means to be human, has been impacted and molded by Him and His existence in such a deep and tangible way that we cannot even fully perceive it. We as humans have, generally speaking, completely lost track and completely taken for granted the God that lovingly made us, and think that we can explain away His existence and completely cut Him out of the picture. It doesn't work. Goodness knows people have tried, and more people will continue to try, and yet it will continue to fail. The 20th century saw such a rise of non-religious institutions founded on scientific rationalization, which led to a catastrophic rise of fascist and communist regimes. Groups which committed horrific atrocities. As it turns out, religion cannot be blamed as the sole cause of war and conflict. A cultural shift towards secularism has proven to be absolutely disastrous. Near the end of his life, while dying of cancer, neurosurgeon and former ironclad atheist, as he referred to himself, Paul Kalanithi, wrote a book about his return to faith while wrestling with his mortality and the failure of secularism. In this book he wrote, "Science may provide the most useful way to organize empirical, reproducible data, but its power to do so is predicated on its inability to grasp the most central aspects of human life: hope, fear, love, hate, beauty, envy, honor, weakness, striving, suffering, virtue." There are things embedded within us that cannot be explained by science and secular reasoning. A society without the hope, love, justice, and forgiveness of God will continue to ascribe to their own subjective ideals, as we saw in such groups as the Young Turks, the Nazis, and the People's Republic of China. Without the abject truth that comes from God, we will continue to crawl around in the mud, digging around for satisfaction, just like so many people who came before us. Kirsten Dombeck in the Parish Review wrote, "I have been an atheist now for more than 15 years, and I have been able to explain to myself almost everything about the faith I grew up in. But I have not been able to explain those experiences of God so real. He entered the bedrooms of his own accord, lit them up with joy, and made people generous. It was like you glimpsed the world's best secret, that love need not be scarce." In her memoirs titled Living with a Wild God, atheist and author Barbara Ehrenreich wrote an experience that she had with God while searching for meaning in her younger years, saying that there was no visions, no prophetic voices or visits by totemic animals, just this blazing everywhere. Something poured into me, and I poured out into it. This was not the passive beatific merger with the all as promised by the Eastern mystics. It was a furious encounter with a living substance that was coming at me through all things at once. And one reason for the terrible wordlessness of this experience is that you cannot observe fire really closely without becoming part of it. Ecstasy would be the word for this, but only if you acknowledge that it does not occupy the same spectrum as happiness or euphoria, that it can resemble an outbreak of violence. Why did she continue to be an atheist after having such an experience? Because the thing that she experienced didn't match with what she had seen in the religious iconography of her youth, and that the experience didn't come with ethical instruction. She had an encounter with a God that she couldn't fully understand, and because she couldn't put him into her box, she rejected him. Despite all of this, she was so impacted by the experience that she went on to become a social activist, feeling a need to help the peoples of the world. Again and again, we see people falling into what I like to call a crisis of unbelief. Knowing and experiencing the reality that there is something more, and yet not being able to apply it to the structures of scientific reasoning or secular humanism. They are starving, but don't recognize the food that's sitting right before them. And so they lie down on the warm, scorched earth, waiting for the scrapper to pick up their broken forms and melt them down into cold oblivion. One of my favorite passages from the Bible that you've probably all heard me say a ton of times is Isaiah 55, 8 through 9. For my thoughts are not your thoughts, nor are your ways my ways, declares the Lord. For as the heavens are higher than the earth, so are my ways higher than yours, and my thoughts than your thoughts. And so we find ourselves in the difficult position of trying to make sense of that which is completely outside of our understanding. To know the unknowable and explain the unexplainable. I'm not going to pretend that it's easy, but I do think that it begs the question. Do you hunger enough to make sense of God? We're going to split up into our small groups now. You can just grab a couple of people near you, and leaders, we will